Well, of course, Gina Miller famously took the government to court in order to enact support that Parliament had to approve Article 50 to be enacted. By the same token, it could be argued that any attempt to leave the EU without an Act of Parliament to endorse it could also be deemed illegal. Of course, this brings into question just what Parliament could do to prevent a no-deal exit, given that there is a clear majority against no deal in Parliament. So, very simply, it could try and legislate to get the government to revoke Article 50, but of course there doesn't appear to be any significant support for that. So that's unlikely, although theoretically possible. We could also see Parliament attempt, and of course not for the first time, mount a motion of no confidence in a government and Prime Minister that attempts to leave the EU with no deal. This certainly is distinctly possible, and given that the government only has a working majority of 4 in the House of Commons, potentially seeing that eroded in the Brecon by-election due soon, it would only take 1 or 2 Conservative MPs to cross the floor to the other side in order to bring the government down, as it were. And then the Queen, of course, would have to summon Jeremy Corbyn within 14 days to see if he and the Labour Party could form a working alternative government. Otherwise, we would then face the prospect of an election. So, a no-confidence motion is certainly possible, and my legal colleagues suggest to me that it is theoretically possible that Parliament could simply legislate to prevent a government or Prime Minister trying to prorogue it, although that in itself is not without problems, as it would set a precedent for Parliament to act in such a fashion against any government action it deems hostile or inappropriate. Of course, the obvious caveat here is that MPs can only propose a motion of such a nature as an amendment to a piece of government legislation, as government usually controls the order of business of the day in terms of what comes before Parliament. The biggest problem here simply is going to be the simple lack of parliamentary sitting days between now and the end of October, given that we're about to enter a summer parliamentary recess, and of course in September we have the party conference season. So therein is the biggest problem. No deal, of course, legally is the default option. If we don't get an agreement between government and Parliament, we can therefore go back to the EU by October 31st and propose something. If nothing is done on this end, no deal becomes the default scenario. Talk of Boris Johnson being able to strike an early trade deal with the US before we've necessarily even left the EU is just sheer bunkum. We will not have a trade deal in place with the US until such a point comes where we have actually left the EU and we no longer wish to be bound by the strictures of the customs union or the single market. That, of course, is the form of Brexit that hardcore Brexiters prefer. They want an absence of single market and customs union, and they don't want the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union. Until such a point comes, if it ever does, we will not have a trade deal in place with the US. The best we can expect in this regard is some kind of woolly statement of common purpose. Ironically, much along the lines of the political declaration of a future relationship between the UK and Europe. The simple reality, of course, is that the US and Europe adopt very different regulatory standards when it comes to things like food standards, GM modified crops, hormone treated beef, environmental standards. Simply incompatible in many cases. So therefore, the only way a trade deal with the US becomes feasible is if we exit the European regulatory framework, if we stay outside of the purview of Brussels laws. As most experts have warned, that would come at a significant cost to the UK and significant disruption to our supply chains. Well, Hammond is stating an obvious fact. It very simply put, in the event of a no-deal departure from the EU, yes, we can control what comes into the UK, but we have no control at all, to quote him, over what happens on the other side of the channel. That would be a matter for the French or the Dutch or the German authorities, for example. Whether they choose to adopt a light touch regulatory regime against stuff coming in from the UK, or whether they choose to clamp down, we simply do not know. We would have to wait and see, but he is absolutely spot on in terms of we can't control what goes on over there. We could try and seek to influence and persuade, ask them to treat us nicely, but we don't control that. That's the whole point. And even if we have a regime in place whereby we get shot of import duties or set tariffs on those things effectively to zero coming in, what goes on in Calais may still have knock-on effects in that regard. Something to repeat, we don't have any control over. Well, until the outcome of the Conservative leadership election is known on July the 22nd, we should interpret anything these two gentlemen say with a big grain of salt. Both, of course, are still jockeying to be leader of the Conservative Party, and that involves trying to persuade the views of some 150,000 odd members who are of an overwhelmingly hardcore Brexit disposition. So interpret anything they say with a grain of salt this time with the outcome of that ballot being known. After that, well, the only way we're going to leave the EU by October the 31st, frankly, is either Parliament passes Theresa May's withdrawal agreement that was rejected 3 times. That is still theoretically possible. I will say this though, that agreement is the only withdrawal agreement on offer. The EU are not going to offer anything else. They've even gone so far as to disband the negotiating team. There is nothing else on the table. If that agreement is not passed, we then enter the scenario of no deal, or either of these two gentlemen going back to Brussels to seek an extension. I still think that one is a case of watch this space. In terms of Boris Johnson's stated position, any attempt to force through a no-deal exit from the EU, should he be able to do so against the wishes of a hostile Parliament, could well result in Parliament extracting its own revenge on a Johnson government via no-confidence motions. It would be a very risky thing for him to do if he were in the position to do so. In terms of Jeremy Hunt's statement, probably more factual. I think it's distinctly likely actually that we will probably still be in the EU come Christmas, but I'd be loath to predict how much longer after that.